Welcome back to my second video in my short little series on the Catholic Church, marriage, and the Council of Trent. In the first video, I presented a syllogism saying that if Jesus didn't institute the sacrament of marriage like the Council of Trent claims that Jesus did, then the Catholic Church isn't the one true church, at least not under that kind of conservative Catholic understanding. Then I spent the entire first video talking about the use of the word mysterion in Greek in the New Testament in the first century, and we focus in particular on Ephesians 5:32. Now let's move past the use of mysterion in the New Testament, and let's talk about marriage in the Patristic Era in the 2nd to 5th centuries. Catholics will want to point to writings on marriage in the Patristic Era for evidence that marriage was a sacrament very early on. The argument might go something like this. If early Christians like St. John Chrysostom, St. Jerome, St. Augustine, if they were all writing as if marriage was indeed a sacrament, well, they must have heard it from the people who taught them, from the people who taught them, from the people, you go back a little bit, not too far, because these are early Christians, right? And boom, it's apostolic, right? So Jesus must have taught that marriage was indeed a sacrament if we have a Christian writing in the 3rd or 4th or 5th century who says that marriage is a sacrament, right? Now, I don't think that that's a great argument, because I think that the whole thing is an argument from silence. 100 years is a long time, much less like 400 years. And so I'm not entirely sure why I should weigh heavily the writings of a 4th century writer, somebody like Jerome or Augustine. I'm not sure, or John Chrysostom. I'm not sure why I should take that, into consideration strongly if the evidence in the 1st century simply isn't there. Because remember, this claim is that Jesus himself established marriage as a sacrament. But we're going to take a look at these patristic sources anyway, since this is an argument that Catholics put forward. Catholics like Zeep87 here put this argument forward. I'm going to zoom back in here. So Zeep87 left a comment under my first video that I'm going to use as a springboard for this second video. So Zeep says, even though the Church Fathers didn't technically call marriage a sacrament, the idea of it being a mystery in which church participation makes it holy, what we call a sacrament, is obviously present. So he cites St. Augustine twice, St. John Chrysostom once, Tertullian once, and then St. Paul, right, in Ephesians 5:32 once. I will not dwell on Ephesians 5:32. I think that 30 minutes in the first video, almost entirely dedicated to Ephesians 5:32. That is plenty. Zeep87 goes on. Here's just to know, when the Bible and early Christians were translating Latin, mysterion was often translated as sacramentum, a term that originally meant an oath of allegiance in the military Roman law, but which Christians adopted later to describe a visible sign of an invisible grace. Thus, in Latin theology, sacramentum became the term that we now call sacraments, but its meaning is tied to mystery. Zeep might have left that comment before he finished my video, because that was the focus of most of my video. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to use numbers 1 through 4 here, right, excluding 5, because we talked about that in the first video, as a springboard for the conversation for the rest of our video. We are going to start with Tertullian, because even though Tertullian was the 4th quote that Zeep provided to us, Tertullian is the earliest temporally. So Tertullian was writing in the late 2nd, early 3rd century. So, in the decades before and after the year 200. This quote that Zeep provided for us comes from a work called Ad or Uxorem, or to the wife. I have it on the screen now in both Latin and in English, and this is actually from book 2 of Ad Uxorem. You can see that this book is mostly about telling Christians not to marry non-Christians. I have quotes on the screen now, both in the original Latin and in the English, And in the English, you can see here that in chapter 3, Tertullian writes, "It is certain that believers contracting marriages with Gentiles are guilty of fornication and are to be excluded from all communion with the brotherhood." So Tertullian is saying, look, if a Christian marries a non-Christian, he's essentially excommunicated. Now, maybe this is like proto-excommunication or something, but this might be kind of like an early anathema or something like that. So Tertullian is saying, that's what the whole book is about. The whole book is like, don't marry non-Christians, guys. So that'll continue into chapter 8. Chapter 8 is where this quote that Zeep provides for us comes from. So I'm going to read from chapter 8. This is the beginning of chapter 8, so not the quote that Zeep provides to us yet, but chapter 8 begins with, "Don't all the strictest lords and the most tenacious of discipline interdict their own slaves from marrying out of their own house?" So don't the strictest lords prevent their slaves from marrying outside of their own house? In order, of course, that they may not run into lascivious excess, desert their duties, purvey their lord's goods to strangers. Yet further, have not the nations decided that such women as have, after their lord's formal warning, persisted in intercourse with other men's slaves, may be claimed as slaves? Shall earthly disciplines be held more strict than heavenly precepts, so that Gentile women, if united to strangers, lose their liberty? Ours can join themselves to the devil's slaves and continue in their former position. So what Tertullian is saying here is, obviously the rules of heaven are going to be stricter than the rules of the earth. And even the Gentiles think that it's fair game to enslave a woman who isn't your slave but marries one of your slaves. Fair game. Go ahead, enslave her. No big deal. And if even the Gentiles think that that's the case, then how much worse is it, because this would be a heavenly law, for a Christian to marry somebody who's not Christian? Certainly, they will become the devil's slave if they marry somebody who isn't a Christian. So you can see this whole book is just, Christians don't marry non-Christians. In particular, Christian women do not marry non-Christian men. So then we scroll down a little bit to the actual quote that Zeep 87 gave to us. This is what Zeep wrote. "So whence are we to find words enough to tell the happiness of the marriage which the church cements, and the oblation confirms, and the benediction signs and seals, which angels carry on the back the news to heaven, which the Father holds to have ratified? For even on earth, children do not rightly and lawfully wed without their parents' consent," all right, so on and so forth. Here's the quote over here in Latin as well. And I think that the full context shows you what Tertullian is saying here. Christians don't marry non-Christians. And that's great and all, but how is this proof that Tertullian considered marriage a sacrament? I think that if you look at this quote out of context, it almost appears like Tertullian is comparing marriage to the Eucharist. As a reminder, the quote that Zeep gave to us was, "How can I describe the happiness of the marriage which the church arranges, the Eucharist strengthens, and the blessing seals?" So here we have the word oblation. The word in Latin is just kind of like offering. Oblatio here, offering, oblation. But that's like an early Christian way of saying like the Eucharist. So I think that the translation of saying the Eucharist is fair. But Tertullian is not saying that marriage is like the Eucharist in as much as it is a sacrament. No. He's saying that it's going to be a much better marriage if you guys can receive communion together. If you aren't both Christians, then you can't receive communion together. And that's kind of sad, according to Tertullian. But what we don't see is the word sacramentum. That word does not appear at all in Ad Uxorem Book 1 or Book 2. But let's steelman the Catholic interpretation of Tertullian now. Zeep said that the church fathers didn't officially call marriage a sacrament, and he's right. But I think that there's actually like a better place if you want to try to read marriage being a sacrament into Tertullian, a better place than To the Wife Book 2. Tertullian uses the word sacramentum in loose association with the word marriage in On Matrimony, chapter 5. Here we are in On Monogamy, on monogamy, and we're going to go down to book 5 right here. And this is where we see the association of the word sacrament or sacramentum with marriage. So Tertullian writes, presenting to you your weakness, the gift of the example of his own flesh, the more perfect Adam, that is Christ, more perfect on this account as well as on others, that he was more entirely pure, stands before you if you are willing to copy him, a voluntary celibate in the flesh. So I know that's kind of weird, but Tertullian is saying Jesus was celibate and he's perfect, and if you're willing to copy him, then great. If, however, you are unequal to that perfection, he stands before you a monogamist in spirit, having one church as his spouse, according to the figure of Adam and of Eve, which figure the apostle interprets of that great sacrament of Christ and the church, teaching that through the spiritual, it was analogous to the carnal monogamy. Okay, so the great sacrament of Christ and the church. So what is the sacrament? Well, Christ is the sacrament, or kind of Christ's relationship with the church is a sacrament. And through the spiritual, it is analogous to carnal monogamy. So this is close. It's again, it's not Tertullian saying that marriage is a sacrament. Tertullian is saying that Christ and the church and their relationship together is a sacrament. But I think that this is probably a stronger argument than Ad Uxorem, book 2. That's what I think. I think that this argument here on monogamy is stronger. Tertullian is the father of Latin Christianity, so his use of the word sacramentum there is very important and is going to have a lot of downstream consequences. So it's worth our time to look into what exactly Tertullian means when he calls something a sacrament. Tertullian gives us some clues in De Baptismo. Here we are in De Baptismo, and we can read within the first, look at this. It's the second word, De Sacramento Aquae Nostrae. So, of the sacrament of our water. Now, if we look over here at the English translation, it says happy mystery of our water, which I think is kind of like interesting to see an English Now, I don't know who did the English translation for this one. Links in the description down below. But this English is translating sacrament as mystery, which like we saw, the only time in the New Testament that the Douay Rheims translated mystery as sacrament was Ephesians 5:32, even though there were 8 occurrences of mystery being translated as sacramentum into the Latin Douay Rheims. So just interesting, but it is clear that Tertullian thought that baptism was a sacrament for sure. But then if we scroll down, we can see another, right here, sacramento, another instance of the word sacrament being used. What is Tertullian saying right here where he's using the word sacrament? This too comes from the old mystic rite. So sacrament is being translated here as old mystic rite, by which Jacob blessed his grandsons, namely the sons of Joseph, Ephraim, and Manasseh. So Tertullian here is referring to the episode in Genesis 48 in which Jacob is blessing his grandsons as a sacrament. So if a blessing from a dying Jacob to his grandchildren is also a sacrament, then what does sacrament actually mean? I mean, to me, if Tertullian is happy to use the word sacrament to describe this Genesis 48 story, then it doesn't mean what it started to mean by the 16th century. But I think we can actually learn what sacrament means by looking at other texts too, texts that predate Tertullian, texts that predate the New Testament. Tertullian didn't invent the term sacrament. He was just the first Christian to use it and to apply it to Christian stuff. Julius Caesar uses the word multiple times in his writings in the 1st century BC, 200-ish years before Tertullian was even born. Here we are in Gaius Julius Caesar's Commentary on the Civil War, Book 1, Chapter 23, in which Caesar writes right here. You could read this in Latin, keyword being here sacramentum. Right here, you can see that. And then if we take a look, so this is chapter 23, right, over here in the Latin. Again, links to the Latin and in the English in the description down below. But over here on the right-hand side of the screen, we can see chapter 23 here. And here you could see that it says, the soldiers of Domitius he ordered to take the oath of allegiance to himself. So I still remember a little bit of Latin from taking Latin, 20 years ago or something like that now. But take a look at this. So it would go something like this. The verb is always at the end of the sentence. So the verb at the end of the sentence right here is eubet. Where is it? Oh, right here. Eubet. So I not the sentence, but the phrase. So the phrase here is milites domi ciano sacramentum alput se dicere eubet. So eubet is going to be the verb. So he orders. Milites is in the accusative, so that's the object of the sentence. So he orders the soldiers. This word right here describes the soldiers, so they are Domitian's soldiers. So he orders Domitian soldiers to do what? Dicere, that is an infinitive, so it's to say or to speak. So he ordered the soldiers of Domitian to say a sacramentum. And if we look over here in the English, we are saying he orders the soldiers of Domitian to take an oath of allegiance. So dicere sacramentum, to take an oath of allegiance. That is how the English is translating dicere sacramentum. In the same book, a little further on in chapter 86, we see the word sacramentum again. And to get to chapter 86 over here on the English side, I do have to go back. So here we are in chapter 86, and we can see that word sacramentum again over here in the Latin. And over here, it's no one should be compelled to take the oath of allegiance against his will, right? So nobody should be forced to say the sacrament or to swear the oath of allegiance, dicere sacramentum. And very quickly, I just want to show you that this was not an uncommon usage. It's not like it's only Julius Caesar who was using it. Here we have Tacitus's Annals in Latin and in English. If I scroll down to here, we have this thing about Missala Valerius, per annos sacramentum in nomen Tiberii. And then if we look down here for the English translation, we have Valerius Missala suggested that the oath of allegiance to Tiberius should be renewed annually. So again, with that word sacramentum being translated as an oath of allegiance. Tacitus again uses that same word in chapters 28, 37, and 42. Livy uses that word in his History of Rome, written in the late 1st century BC. I'm not going to show those, though. I think I've proven my point. That word is a word that had a pre-existing use before Christianity existed. And that was an oath taken by a Roman soldier in the army, an oath of allegiance. Tertullian took this word and repurposed it for Christian purposes. Just like how soldiers speak a sacramentum to Caesar, Christians have their own oaths of loyalty, their own sacraments, but not to Caesar, but to the Christian God. Baptism is that oath of loyalty to the Christian God, implies Tertullian. Tertullian's most famous quote is, Christians are not born, they are made. And to him, getting baptized is how a Christian is made. That's why it's a sacrament, an oath of allegiance. So here we have it. Julius Caesar uses the word sacrament to mean an oath of allegiance in the 1st century BC, and then by the late 2nd or early 3rd century, Tertullian co-opts that word for Christian purposes, referring to baptism as a Christian oath of allegiance to God. But that's not entirely dissimilar from what Julius Caesar meant when he used the word sacrament. So how did we get from Tertullian's usage in the late 2nd, early 3rd century to the Council of Trent insisting that there's only 7 sacraments and they are this exact thing that was instituted by Jesus himself? Well, we have a lot of ground to cover before we get there, but I think I need to start moving a lot faster because this video alone is already like 20 minutes or something like that. And by this point, we're just getting so far removed from Jesus that I think that my argument is almost done. Like, the idea that Jesus instituted sacraments is just not the case. Sacraments are a later innovation of later Christians. And like, it starts in earnest right around the year 200 with Tertullian, but it changes a lot by the 16th century because Tertullian definitely doesn't think that there's only 7 sacraments. And in fact, he's referring to, like, the Old Testament, Jacob blessing his grandsons as a sacrament and stuff like that, which the church would not say that any sacraments existed in the Old Testament, right? Because they were instituted by Jesus in the 1st century. So things are getting so far removed that I think that my argument is about done. However, there is some interesting ground that we can cover, particularly with even later Christians like Augustine and St. John Chrysostom. So now we move into the 4th century and the early 5th century with John Chrysostom and Augustine. They were contemporaries. Jerome too. Again, this is so far removed from the time of Jesus that I think this doesn't matter a whole lot, so I will try to move a little bit quicker, but I still think it's worth addressing. So our friend Zeep did give us this quote from Homily 20 on Ephesians. What does it mean that it is a mystery? It means that it is a symbol of something great and admirable. Marriage is the image of the union of Christ and the church. So yeah, I think this is all well and good. But again, that would be the Greek word mysterion, not the Latin word sacramentum. And I don't think that there's a good argument that says that any time that a Greek speaker uses mysterion, you can just go ahead and insert sacramentum. I don't think that that's the case. I don't think that oath of allegiance and mystery are interchangeable in that way. The two words just don't mean the same thing, and the Douay Rheims knows this, and that's why the Douay Rheims fixed the mistakes of the Vulgate in 7 out of the 8 times that the Vulgate translates mysterion into sacramentum. Again, only leaving Ephesians 5:32. Why? Because it would be really convenient if that said sacramentum. I guess. Maybe I'm just jaded. But anyway, for whatever it's worth, I do think that Chrysostom thought that marriage was a mystery and that there was an analogy between Jesus' union with the church and a person's union with their spouse. And further, I also think that Chrysostom thinks that Holy Communion, the Eucharist, is a mystery. Read almost anywhere in Chrysostom's writings, and he'll be referring to Holy Communion as a mystery left and right. Baptism, too. John Chrysostom talks about baptism as a mystery. But again, I don't think that this is the same usage as the 16th century usage of the word sacramentum. And I say that because John Chrysostom refers to a lot of things as mysteries. It's not like he's only referring to the 7 sacraments as mysteries, right? So in his homilies on the Gospel of John Chrysostom says that the way that God inhabits the tabernacle and how this tabernacle imagery is foreshadowing the resurrection, that is a mystery. So what then was the tabernacle in which he dwelt? Here the prophets say, I will raise up the tabernacle of David that is fallen. That's from Amos. It was fallen indeed. Our nature had fallen, an incurable fall, and needed only that mighty hand. There was no possibility of raising it again, had not he who fashioned it at first stretched forth to it his hand and stamped it new with his image by the regeneration of water and spirit. And observe, I pray you, the awful and ineffable nature of the mystery. He inhabits this tabernacle forever, for he clothed himself with our flesh, not as again to leave it, but always to have it with him. So the way that Jesus took on human flesh, the way that God inhabits his tabernacle, that is a mystery, according to John Chrysostom. And that's not the only weird thing that, not weird, but that's not the only thing that he refers to as a mystery. The way that the star led the wise men to the child Jesus, that is also a mystery. Take a look at this. Now the star from heaven, which called again the wise men to worship him, the vast throng pouring everywhere of angels attending the Lord and hymning his praise, and besides them many other heralds sprang up on a sudden, and all, as they met, declared to one another the glad tidings of this ineffable mystery. The angels to the shepherds to those city, Gabriel to Mary and Elizabeth, Anna and Simon to those who came to the temple. So it seems as if this mystery is the way in which the star led all of these people to the birth of the Lord, right? So maybe the nativity more broadly is the mystery. Maybe more specifically, it's like the way that the star led the wise men to the child Jesus was a mystery. But regardless, that seems, not in line, right? If mystery just means sacrament, then Chrysostom is calling the star and the wise men, like in the way that the wise men found that's a mystery. Is a sacrament? No, I don't think it's a sacrament. There's other stuff. So the reason why Jesus chose a 3-day period to pass between his death and his resurrection is a mystery. He also easily died and rose again when he willed, or rather much more easily, though he tarried 3 days for a dispensation of a certain mystery. So it's a mystery as to why he tarried for 3 days. Why didn't he die and then come back immediately or the next day or something? Well, I think that seems to be some kind of mystery according to John Chrysostom. That's not the only thing. We'll do one more just to show you that John Chrysostom calls a ton of things a mystery. So the fact that which is born of the flesh is flesh, and that which is born of the spirit is a mystery. So, right. So this part is called that which is born of the flesh is flesh, and that which is born of the spirit is spirit. Great mysteries are they, of which the only begotten Son of God has counted us worthy. Great, and such as we are not worthy of, but such as it was meet for him to give. So these teachings of Jesus, such as that which is born of flesh is flesh and spirit is spirit, that is a mystery. So again, it just seems really clear to me that Chrysostom meant something when he said mystery, but that was not one of these 7 outward signs of internal grace or something that have a certain matter and form. No, Chrysostom seemed to have something very different in mind when he used that Greek word mysterion. The Greek word mysterion, as it was being used in the 4th and the 5th century, simply didn't mean the same thing as the word sacramentum in the 16th century. It had a much wider usage, and so appealing to this word mysterion as proof that marriage is a sacrament, to me, it really seems like it just does not follow. With Chrysostom's portion of the video done, let's now move to Augustine. Since Augustine was a contemporary of Chrysostom, I don't think that his opinion matters too much. Augustine was born over 300 years after Jesus died, so Augustine's thought on the matter don't really seem to impact whether or not marriage was instituted by Jesus. Now, with that caveat out of the way, I do think that Augustine is probably the temporally second big step in the development of sacramental theology. So Tertullian borrowed that word from its Roman military and political usage, and then Augustine used it and popularized it more so than Tertullian did. But how did Augustine use that word? Well, let's return to How Marriage Became One of the Sacraments, pages 142 to 143. Section 4.3 is called Bonum Sacramenti, and I'm going to read the first little bit. Augustine's concept of the good of sacrament is clear as to its extension, but elusive as to its intention. In other words, it is easy to grasp what feature of marriage Augustine denotes with the word sacramentum, but it is difficult to grasp what he means by calling it a sacramentum. Perhaps Augustine himself did not know exactly. The interpreter must remain open to allusions, associations, and rhetoric. The term sacrament had several appropriate and helpfully suggestive connotations. It suggested holiness and significance, for, according to one definition, a sacrament was a sacred sign, sacrum signum. It also suggested permanence, for the term had a range of uses in classical Latin pertaining to sureties, solemn oaths, and vows. It was chiefly for that reason that Christian authors before Augustine had used the term sacrament to refer to the mutual obligation that binds husband and wife. It reminded Augustine of the enduring sacrament of faith, Sacramentum Fidei, that one received through baptism, to which he compared the bond of marriage, as well as suggesting an undefined penumbra of sanctity. The term identified something in marriage that pointed beyond marriage itself to what Augustine called some greater reality. It is important to note that although the word sacramentum in Latin, like mysterion in Greek, was used to denote religious and initiatic rites, and although Augustine used the term in that sense to refer to pagan rites, as well as to baptism and Eucharist, he never called marriage a sacrament in a ritual or liturgical sense. So let's do for Augustine what we did for Chrysostom and Mysterion, but now with Sacramentum, since Augustine was writing in Latin. On page 500 of the Complete Works of Augustine, we see Augustine referring to the Old Testament animal sacrifices as sacramentum. Here we are on page 500 of the Complete Works of Augustine. We must believe then that God has no need, not only of cattle, nor of any other earthly or material thing, but even of man's righteousness. For whatever right worship is paid to God profits not God, but man. For no man would say that he benefited a fountain by drinking, or benefited the light by seeing. And the fact that the ancient church offered animal sacrifices, which the people of God nowadays read of without imitating, proves nothing else than this, that those sacrifices signify the things which we do for the purpose of drawing near to God, and inducing our neighbor to do the same. A sacrifice, therefore, is the visible sacrament or sacred sign of an invisible sacrifice. So, there you go. These Old Testament animal offerings were sacraments, according to Augustine. I mean, that alone should show that whatever Augustine meant by sacrament just wasn't the same as the 16th century Council of Trent definition of the term sacrament, of one of seven, explicit things instituted by Jesus himself. We can keep reading on page 2150 of the Complete Works of Augustine, that it's not just animal sacrifice, it's also circumcision. So Augustine writes, "Had I been a Jew in the time of that ancient people, when there was nothing better that I could be, I would undoubtedly have received circumcision. That seal of righteousness, which is by faith, was of so great importance in that dispensation before it was abrogated by the Lord's coming, that the angel would have strangled the infant child Moses, had not the child's mother, seizing a stone, circumcised the child, and by this sacrament averted impending death." So clearly, circumcision is some kind of sacrament. In fact, on page 2237, Augustine writes about Jewish sacraments, right? So Paul was indeed a Jew, and he had become, when he had become a Christian, he had not abandoned those Jewish sacraments, which that people had received in the right way and for a certain appointed time. So even though he was an apostle of Christ, he took part in observing these Jewish sacraments. So again, if there are Jewish sacraments, and there's definitely not only one of seven, of which holy orders is one, no, that's not what Augustine would have had in mind. Lastly, if we go to page 1173, we get this footnote from the people who compiled this complete works of Augustine. So, the fathers gave the name of sacrament or mystery to everything which conveyed one significant or property to unassisted reason, and another to faith. Hence, Cyprian speaks of the sacraments of the Lord's Prayer, meaning the hidden meaning conveyed therein, which could only be appreciated by a Christian. The fathers sometimes speak of confirmation as a sacrament because the chrism signified the grace of the Holy Ghost, and the imposition of hands was not merely a bare sign, but the form by which it was conveyed. Yet, at the same time, they continually speak of the two great sacraments of the Christian church, and that would refer to baptism and oblation, the offering, Holy Communion, the Eucharist. I really thought that I was going to be able to get through all of this in less than 30 minutes, but I have an entire section left, and this would be marriage in the medieval era, in which I was going to start talking about the matter and form of the sacrament. And this video is already like 36 minutes or something like that, so I am going to have to do a part 3 because I'm trying to make my videos shorter, and I'm just not doing a very good job about it. So I think that I've put to bed the idea that Mysterion and even Sacramentum through the 5th century just didn't mean what it meant at the Council of Trent. And that this idea that Jesus founded 7 sacraments it's just a later accretion. It's not present in what we've reviewed so far up to the 5th century. When early Christians like the Patristics, and even in the 1st century in the actual New Testament, when they're writing about mysterions and sacramentums, the meaning is just something different. Regarding the matter and the form, I think that this is perhaps the clearest to me, that marriage was not a sacrament because the matter and the form was simply not present in essentially the entire first millennium. But I am going to have to save that for the next video, and that one will definitely be the last video in this little, what will now be a 3-video series on marriage, the sacraments, and the Council of Trent. Thanks everybody for watching, and I will see you in part 3.